morning, everyone. Just have everyone take their seats if you don't mind. Good morning and welcome to DeSales University. My name is Jennifer Moore and I am the chair of the Social Sciences Department. It is my honor and privilege to welcome all of you to the opening ceremonies for the DeSales University Center for Homeland Security. DeSales University is committed to meeting the needs of our community with innovative and state-of-the-art programming. We recognize the critical need for our students to understand the developing threat against our homeland. So 4 years ago, we began our focus on Homeland Security by developing an undergraduate major here at DeSales. We continue to work forward and created graduate level courses in our Master of Arts in Criminal Justice program. After years of careful planning, we are now happy to announce the commencement of our Center for Homeland Security. We are privileged to have Dr. Ahmet Yela here with us today. He is a full-time faculty member and a director of this new center, and we are thrilled that he has joined us to help us lead forward this effort. But I am not here today just to announce the creation of a new center. Instead, we'd like to view this as a partnership with all of you. We would like to work together with our partners at the state, local, national, even international levels, and also work with our partners in the private sector, in business, in cybersecurity, and healthcare. We would like to view this center as a collaboration, an effort where we all work together with our common goals of education, outreach, and research. So in this collaboration, we want and need your help. So please be in contact with us on how we could help better serve the community, on how our students can help serve your organizations through internships or volunteer opportunities. We really would like this to be the first step in a collaboration moving forward. We would not be here today without the unwavering support of our administration. In particular, I'd like to recognize our Dean of Undergraduate Education, Robert Blumenstein, whose leadership in this endeavor has been unrelenting and fantastic. I'd also like to thank our provost, Brother Dan Wisniewski, and our president, Jim Greenfield. So without their support, events like this and the Center for Homeland Security would not be possible. I'd also like to recognize our distinguished speakers that are joining us here today. We have Dr. Bruce Hoffman, Dr. Colin Clarke, and Mr. David Wells. And they are going to share with you some of their expertise in this evolving field of Homeland Security. Thank you again for being here today. And it is my honor and privilege to introduce Father Jim Greenfield.
Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to add my words of welcome to Dr. Jennifer Moore. I'm delighted to see everyone here. This really is a momentous day. I welcome you here to DeSales University. It's a Catholic Salesian university in the Lehigh Valley, and one of the best ways that I could use to describe our Catholic Salesian ethos is to just point you in the direction of the banners that hopefully you saw as you came here today. It says, "Be who you are and be that well." And we really believe that that is the guiding ethos of everything we do here. I don't know about you, but I was thrilled as we came in to have the doors held for all of us from our wonderful students who are in these programs. And don't they look good with those with their swag? I just want to know where we can go to purchase one of those quarter zips. I think they're great. And we're also happy that we want the students here so that they can interact with all of you, because we're thinking internships and all of those wonderful things that emerge from this kind of professional association. This Center for Homeland Security, as Jennifer shared with us, is truly an epic program that we're bringing to this campus. Unfortunately, this is a growing business, isn't it? And we have to deal with some of the issues that are prevalent in our society today. And so we at DeSales University really believe that this is the first of its kind, not just in the Lehigh Valley, but in many areas of this United States, that we want to use this as a place to focus our attention on what is important, and that is to stay secure. We here at DeSales University pride ourselves on our partnerships, especially in this beautiful Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania. One thriving example of our partnership is with the Lehigh County District Attorney's Office, and we're proud that Jim Martin is with us today, with the creation of the Petzold Lab, which is right here in another building on our campus, and you'll hear more about that as we proceed today. Just very briefly, as I was preparing my remarks, I went onto the webpage of Homeland Security, and the first thing I saw, besides the appointment of the new acting secretary, was to get involved. And I saw things like learn more, get involved, make a difference, be cyber smart, the Blue campaign to fight human trafficking, etc. These are things that DeSales University is already meeting. 2 weeks ago, we had an awareness week for the plight of human trafficking just in the Lehigh Valley. This week, we're Homelessness Awareness Week and some of the issues that emanate from that. We offer a program in cybersecurity, so we really feel like at DeSales University, we're making a difference. For me personally, Homeland Security became very apparent the day I got my TSA pre-check. That was one of the happiest days of my life as a traveler. And so there's many things that emanate as a result of this. We have more than 150 professionals who will be with us throughout the proceedings of the day. As you know, it's a whole morning. Many of you are here now. Some are coming mid-morning, etc. So we're delighted to welcome all of you. But we especially want to welcome one of our distinguished alums, the Honorable Joseph J. Leeson, U.S. District Court of Eastern District of Pennsylvania, who's with us, the Lehigh County Executive, Phillips Armstrong, Marta Gabriel, Regional Manager representing Senator Toomey, Ellen Kern, Chief of Staff for Senator Pat Brown, Zachary Lysek from the Northampton County Coroner's Office, and Bill Royer, a constituent outreach representing State Representative Ryan McKenzie, and of course, everyone here. Just in conclusion, I offer you some highlights of DeSales University. Obviously, I always say the best part of DeSales University is our campus, so you have to come here. We're also honored that hopefully in the next few months, there's going to be a Wawa around the corner. Our students are happy about that. That would only make it better if there were a Chick-fil-A next to it. We've offered undergraduate major in neuroscience. We brought it online last year. We have a new program that is going to just be a part of every other program here on campus, and it's a program in applied AI and data analytics, because we believe here that big data is here to stay, and we're doing something about that. We just brought online a new program, a master's in higher education. That's the first of its kind in the Lehigh Valley. We've offered a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing with summer residency in places like Galway this year in Scotland. And the most recent addition to our campus is a 36-foot Christmas tree on the mall. So we're delighted about that. Thank you so much for being with us. And now it's my honor to introduce Dr. Amit Yalla. As you can see in the program there, he's the director of our new Center for Homeland Security here at DeSales. He's an assistant professor of Homeland Security. He's also a member of the faculty at Georgetown University and in the School of Continuing Studies program in the Master's in Applied Artificial Intelligence. Additionally, Dr. Yalla is a research fellow at the George Washington University program on extremism. We are so proud that he is part of our faculty. One of the things I'd like to share with you is a few months ago, Brother Dan Wisniewski, our provost, and I were invited to his home to break the Ramadan fast. So he's a fantastic chef in addition to all of the things that he does here. To sit around a table, to break bread that we did with his wife and his son was a real lens for me to see the wonder of this human being. And I'm so proud as the president of DeSales University, along with all of my colleagues, that Dr. Amit Yalla is with us, and I now introduce him to the podium.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my honor to be here. Thank you very much for your nice and kind words, Father Jim. I would like to start my speech by welcoming you all here to the opening of DeSales University Center for Homeland Security. Welcome. First of all, I would like to thank you for their ongoing support and kindness during the time we have been working on the establishment of this new center. I would like to recognize and honor Father Jim, Brother Dan, Dr. Blumenstein, and Dr. Moore for their ongoing support and patience with me during this process. Thank you. It's been my privilege to work here at DeSales University. It is my second year, and I feel like DeSales is a large family, and I certainly feel one of the members of this large family. Thank you. I have been in the business of Homeland Security and Counterterrorism almost for 30 years now. I started as a police sergeant immediately in countering terrorism in Turkey. I am originally from Turkey. I had my Ph.D. in the United States back in 2000, studying countering terrorism. And with us today, Dr. Bruce Hoffman, whom I cited during my PhD dissertation because there were very few work on countering terrorism, and he was one of my heroes from those times. And additionally, we have other friends, Dr. Clarke, David Wells, Mr. Jim Martin, Mr. William from the Homeland Security. So I would like to welcome them all. Thank you for being here. So a little bit about this center. I'm not going to read the mission center. You can always read mission statement. You can always read it. But I am going to talk a little bit about Homeland Security and the concept of Homeland Security and the paradigm shift in Homeland Security. We have our students here. I also would like to welcome them all. And we have been discussing about these issues. Our DSA students are great. And what we have been studying is, what do we understand from Homeland Security? Is it only the United States, or with all technological changes, with the internet, with the social media, are we focusing on something bigger? Is protecting the United States enough, only United States enough to achieve in our goals to prevent threats to the United States? This might be the biggest question we need to focus nowadays, because what we feel extensively is focusing on the United States when it comes to providing security to our homeland may not be enough. A distant terrorist activity around the world might spark a similar terrorist activity here in the homeland. As we have all seen, for example, New York truck ramming attack was a copied attack that was happening all around the world, carried out by the terrorist organization ISIS. Therefore, when we talk about Homeland Security, we now have a smaller globe connected to each other through the internet and social media, that any spark around the globe would be affecting the United States here in the homeland, or our interests around the world, our people around the world. Secondly, when it comes to providing security and securing our homeland, I think what we need to understand is ignorance is our worst enemy. If we do not know our enemy, if we do not understand our enemy, if we do not follow the new trends, the new literature these terrorist organizations are producing daily, we may not be able to at least one step ahead of this game, and therefore we may not be able to prevent future terrorist attacks. Therefore, being uneducated, being unprepared, being unready is never excusable. And basically and simply, this center aims to work with our community, with our students, with our partners to increase this awareness, to fight back against ignorance, and to increase this flag higher than ever, so that we are successful in the protection of our homeland. So what are we going to do with this center? When we were talking about establishing this center, we had a few important aims. The first was being able to educate and train not only our students who are welcomed here, but also reaching out to our partners, law enforcement agencies, emergency management agencies, first responders, federal agencies, and others to work with them, not only to share our facilities and experiences, but also to learn from their experiences, their field work, so that we can combine all those literature to further our knowledge and understanding. Therefore, we aim to work with our partners to provide education and training, and also to carry out research activities where we can work not only with the academicians and researchers, but also with you who are the front runners of day-to-day homeland security and law enforcement related professionals. We aim to be the part of this big network locally, then maybe regionally, nationally, and even internationally. We would like to help our friends, our partners to better deal with the huge issues, with the grand problems we are facing. We also have great opportunities here at DeSales. We have different departments where we can collaborate, like computer science department, health and nursing department, to carry out homeland security related research. When it comes to our audience, as we mentioned, it is not only local, regional, national, and international. We have great students here, and we are expecting to get more students. And we are very much trying to work with our local partners from Homeland Security, criminal justice professionals. We welcome you all here all the time. We are working very closely with our military members, with our veterans. First responders and local agencies are our eyes and ears on the ground when it comes to dealing with terrorism and natural disasters. Without them, we cannot survive. And private sector and businesses are our partners because they are the ones who are producing the required and needed technologies, devices, know-how to deal with different types of homeland security related tasks. We are going to have 3 branches of this center. The first is education, the second is research, and the third is outreach. In our education programs, we have a bachelor's degree and undergraduate degree in Homeland Security. We already have great students right now studying their degrees. We have a master's degree in criminal justice, where we are going to be providing graduate level programs and courses related with Homeland Security. In our bachelor degree, we focus to the real life scenarios, to the real life issues. We work with our students so that they can think critically, they can lead decisively, act ethically. We are trying to prepare them for their future positions in different professional related areas in Homeland Security, where they can immediately start working after graduating from DeSales, after getting their degrees. With our 2 newly established certification programs, we are trying to work with our students and with our partners to enhance their understanding and skill sets in the fight against terrorism and in the protection of our homeland. The first certification program that we are offering is Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Investigations. Our idea is to work with our students and partners to enable them better understand the historical and ideological aspects of terrorism and homeland security related issues, to provide them necessary tools to investigate these crimes, and also skill sets like hostage negotiations and intelligence analysis when it comes to dealing with these complicated issues. Beyond that, we are offering counterterrorism digital forensics. As we all know that we now cannot think of any crimes that are not associated with any types of digital evidence, any types of digital devices, and it is impossible to investigate, just like different regular criminal activities, terrorist actions, terrorist activities, terrorist attacks, and what's happening over the cyberspace. Therefore, it is necessary for our members, for our friends, to have a better understanding of how terrorist organizations are using the cyberspace, how they are using different digital mediums to carry out their day-to-day activities, and how we can teach them what to look for and how to find digital evidence related with terrorism and terrorist cases. Here at DeSales, we have a philosophy where we can pass our experiences, as most of our professors, not only they have their degrees, but also their experiences from the field. And we are trying to teach our students beyond the textbook with a combination of our experiences and the real life examples. When we talk about terrorism, we subject them to real terrorist materials like terrorist journals. Our students make presentations of terrorist journals so that they can understand what these terrorist organizations are talking about and how we can better prepare our students to understand the logic of these terrorist organizations. Our research activities are going to focus on our community and our partners' needs first. We are aiming to work our partners and the local community to find solutions to their day-to-day problems and to help them to better deal with these problems through academic and scientific research. We see our partners, our greatest assets in these research activities, because we aim to work with our friends when we are carrying out these activities. Outreach is one of the most important aspects of this center. We are aiming to work with our friends, as we are doing now through different mediums, but we are trying to extend these partnerships beyond what we have currently, so that we can provide our expertise to our local agencies, to our local friends, but at the same time, our students have more opportunities to get to know you guys, to work with you as interns or during their field works. Thank you very much for your patience. I would like to now invite Mr. Jim Martin, District Attorney of Lehigh Region. Thank you very much for being with us.
Good morning, everyone. Father Greenfield, Professor Yala, Judge Leeson. You know, prudent lawyers always recognize judges when they're in the audience. Judge Leeson and I are old friends. I want to thank you for the opportunity of appearing here this morning. This is a great day for DeSales, and it's a great day for the local law enforcement community. We've had the benefit in the Lehigh Valley of a long and mutually beneficial relationship with this university. Since 2011, we've had on campus, as Father Greenfield mentioned, the Officer David M. Petzold Memorial Digital Laboratory of the Lehigh County. That Digital Forensics Center has proved extremely helpful in the investigation of many crimes, including homicides, and has helped immeasurably in the efforts of my office in prosecuting perpetrators and convicting them. It's not an exaggeration to say that there are several homicides that would not have been solved without what we have the benefit of here at the Petzold Lab. That lab is managed by Paul Iannacci, who is a retired Pennsylvania State Police trooper, who's in the audience. Where are you, Paul? Somewhere. There you are. Paul has been involved in digital forensics throughout his career with Pennsylvania State Police. He has been the commanding officer of the Petzold Lab. He's the lab manager. He's a jack of all trades, and he's a master, really, of all of them. Don't let that go to your head, Paul. But he advises me that since March of 2011, we have had the benefit and the luxury of having had 45 DeSales students come through that laboratory as interns. They have done an outstanding job. The first 2 civilian employees of that laboratory who I hired were both graduates of DeSales University. Both had worked in the lab. One held a master's degree from the criminal justice program. And after several years, both have left the lab, unfortunately for us. Fortunately for them, they've gone into private industry where they're making a ton more money than Lehigh County could afford to pay them. But that's really a win-win for all of us. Obviously, the fact that we are able to tout that kind of accomplishment on the part of DeSales University is good for the university. It's good for the Petzold Laboratory. It's good for the reputation of the law enforcement community in Lehigh County and Northampton County. Given our very favorable experience through the partnership with the Petzold Digital Forensics Laboratory, I look forward to continuing a similar relationship with the Center for Homeland Security. As many of you know, we've had a very valuable and close relationship with Homeland Security investigations in both the Philadelphia and in the Washington, Virginia areas of responsibility through the Regional Intelligence and Investigation Center, which we refer to as the RIC. That's not located on the campus. It's located in Center City, Allentown. It is directed by Julia Kosis, who's here today. Julia, raise your hand. Thank you. Julia is a graduate of Cedar Crest College, but she received her master's in criminal justice here at DeSales. And she does an outstanding job at the laboratory. We have had at the RIC the benefit of having had 20 interns over the years from the undergraduate criminal justice program here. We currently have one from the undergraduate program, and we have one from the graduate school working at the RIC. And I think that they are receiving benefit, as are we, as a result of that relationship. So in closing, I certainly congratulate you, Father Greenfield, Dr. Yala, and all the people here at DeSales who have had a hand in creating this wonderful center. I'm sure that we will have the opportunity, I hope we will have the opportunity to continue the internship program both at the RIC and at the Petzold Center with students from the Homeland Security major. And obviously with the outstanding experience that we've had over the years with those interns and with DeSales, that program will be the first that we will look to for our future employees. So I wish you the best of luck. I'm sure you'll be successful, and I thank you again for the opportunity.
I would like to now invite Mr. William S. Walker, Deputy Special Agent in Charge, Homeland Security Investigations, Philadelphia.
Well, good morning. Thank you, Father Jim. Thank you, Dr. Yala. Thank you, DeSales University, for the opportunity and the invite to be here with you today. It really is a pleasure. And I want to congratulate DeSales on this very important milestone. It's pretty cool to be here. As Dr. Yala mentioned, my name is Bill Walker. I currently serve as the Deputy Special Agent in Charge for Homeland Security Investigations in Philadelphia. Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI, is an extraordinarily robust federal law enforcement agency, and yet it may be one that many of you in the room are not very familiar. So as you prepare to open your Center for Homeland Security, let me take a step back and just talk a little bit about the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, DHS. And that the Department of Homeland Security is the place where HSI calls home in the U.S. government. So as many of you know, DHS was created in 2003 in the response to the terrorist attacks of 9/11. DHS is an extraordinarily large, I'd say, behemoth department. There's 22 unique federal agencies that comprise the Department of Homeland Security, with about 250,000 employees. Again, HSI is one of the agencies that falls under DHS. And while the composition and the leadership of the department has changed, ebbed and flowed in the 16 years since it was created, I can tell you that the mission statement generally is the same, and that is, with honor and integrity, we will safeguard the American people, our homeland, and our values. My agency is HSI, the largest investigative agency within DHS. Like I said, it's a potent agency. It's one that you may not be very familiar with yet, but like your center, we're new. Our legacy only really lasts about a decade. But I can tell you this, our work speaks for itself. So HSI is the second largest federal investigative agency. We enforce over 400 statutes, and our primary mission is to investigate criminal organizations who perpetrate illicit transborder trade, travel, and finance schemes against the American public. We have 7,000 special agents, 3,000 intelligence and mission support professionals dedicated to 200 offices in the United States and another 70 offices overseas. Because of our transnational focus, the overseas aspect is very important. And so I can tell you that our reach is expansive, and I'm happy to report that it's also growing, which is good for like this section of the room, I think. As a leader within DHS, my primary responsibility is to ensure that HSI Philadelphia, which covers the entire state of Pennsylvania and Delaware, is properly resourced and equipped to address the primary criminal and national security threats that impact our region. With the DHS mission statement in mind, I direct my office's goals to ensure that we remain focused on investigating the criminal organizations who hamper the national security of our communities. So probably the best example of that is HSI is a leading contributor to the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force program. And we work closely with the other federal law enforcement agencies, state and local as well, who are part of the JTTF program, to utilize our authorities to try to disrupt terrorist events before they happen and try to work on focusing on those who support them. But I can tell you this, our national security efforts are far more expansive than just our counterterrorism efforts. In Philadelphia, for example, HSI dedicates an entire team of agents and analysts to preventing the illegal export of sensitive commodities, munitions, and technologies that could be used by our enemies against our warfighters who are fighting on our behalf overseas. In one recent investigation, we arrested an Iranian arms trafficker who was involved in selling and exporting sensitive technologies to Iran, which was obviously a prohibited entity. In another example, HSI dedicates a team of agents to investigating human rights violators and war criminals, those that committed genocide in their home countries, evaded capture, and now seek safe haven in the United States. I think few would argue that that's a righteous effort. We had a case recently where we were able to hold accountable a Liberian genocidaire who had committed mass atrocities in his home country and was living in Southwest Philadelphia. For his crimes, he was sentenced to 30 years incarceration and served notice to the community that we won't stop there. HSI Philadelphia and our task force officers work closely with U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the U.S. Coast Guard, screening passengers and cargo at our borders for national security threats. These close partnerships resulted in the June 2019 seizure of 20 tons, 40,000 pounds of cocaine at the Port of Philadelphia, and the arrests of 8 crew members on the vessel who were involved in smuggling the cocaine. And so these investigations, I think, are a brief microcosm of HSI's national security efforts. We address vulnerabilities in the Homeland Security apparatus in an attempt to prevent malicious actors from obtaining the tools they need to impact our communities. Essentially, we investigate criminal organizations who commit crimes at or near the borders. And so central to these collective efforts and successes, I think, are three main factors: outreach, partnerships, and education. I'll touch on each factor. Outreach to private and public sectors is important as we spread the word about HSI's mission, authorities, and capabilities. HSI's offices have conducted over 300 outreach presentations in the last year alone to key industry, NGOs, and educational institutions. So relationships formed during these strategic outreach efforts prove valuable to all when it comes to securing our homeland. Partnerships. HSI, really no federal agency can do it alone. There are many crime problems that we can't simply arrest our way out of. It takes sustained partnerships with law enforcement and community organizations to make a true impact and keep that impact sustained and lasting. HSI, for example, has over 100 task force officers in our Pennsylvania and Delaware offices from dozens of federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies. The partnerships with you all in this room, to include the Lehigh County DA's office, the Allentown Police Department, and many others in this room, are the reason why we've been able to be successful and impactful in the area. I point to cases that we've investigated, particularly in the human trafficking and drug trafficking realm, with our partners as a primary example of that. Like outreach, information sharing is crucial if we are truly serious about defending the homeland from national security and transnational criminal threats. And last but certainly not least is education. In my opinion, education is the key. HSI strives to stay up with the technologies exploited by criminals so that we can try to keep up with the bad guys. But it goes beyond training. It goes toward our recruitment. This is where I turn to this side of the room. Through outreach and partnerships, my office is striving to build and advertise opportunities for your students, university students, to collaborate with our special agents, intelligence analysts, and mission support professionals. We're looking for the skill sets we need to make our cases even better and our impact in the community even more effective. Foreign language aptitude, cyber and forensics capabilities, and other specialized experiences are traits and skills that provide our newest agents and analysts the best opportunity to obtain and succeed in their employment. Going hand in hand with education is creativity and innovation. I find myself constantly amazed at how HSI agents and analysts use their own creativity and ingenuity to tackle a particular crime problem. It underscores the idea that law enforcement agencies must be open to new and innovative ways of tackling and addressing transnational and national security cross-border crime problems that plague our communities. So for those of you in the room who are just beginning your law enforcement career aspirations, challenge yourself to be creative and offer your outside-the-box ideas. The more innovative minds we have in the room, in my opinion, the better. And so in closing, I'd like to thank DeSales University, Father Jim, Dr. Yala, for the opportunity to speak with you this morning. I'd like to wish your new Center for Homeland Security nothing but complete and total success. And I look forward to HSI with my counterparts here from HSI in the room to continuing to work and partner with the university. Thank you for your time.
I would like to introduce now Dr. Bruce Hoffman, Professor, Georgetown University Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service.
Well, thank you very much, Ahmed, for the very kind introduction. President Greenfield, thank you very much for the invitation to come speak here today. when, I'm going to call him Ahmed because I've known him for many years, he's a valued friend, a mentor in many respects too, given his own rich history in counterterrorism and his own experiences. I was both honored and delighted when he asked me to come speak here today because I've spent a lot of time studying terrorism over the past 4+ decades. And in recent months, actually, I was, for a variety of reasons, at other presentations, invitations, I was asked to pull together some thoughts on the study of terrorism. And when Ahmed sent me the literature about the new program, the new academic programs that were being unveiled at DeSales University and the new Center for Homeland Security, the core message of education, research, and outreach, of service to the community, of integrating all the different components of counterterrorism, academic practitioners, and especially of training a new generation of counterterrorism and homeland security practitioners resonated completely with my views, and I think also with the experience I've had now for many decades in this field. Over the past 43 years, I've worked at universities, at think tanks, in the United States government. I've edited and continue to edit a scholarly journal, a scholarly book series. And I tell you all of that not to sort of brag about my curriculum vitae, but to say that it's given me an enormous perspective on what are the most important core elements that are involved in the study of terrorism, and indeed in educating this new generation of students who are going to assume positions not only as practitioners, but as leaders. You know, if it all comes down to the ethics and values that your parents instilled in you as a child, one can say it's the exact same thing as students with their teachers. And I think the students at DeSales University are enormously fortunate to be able to call upon the educational credentials and mentorship capabilities of persons like Ahmed and Professor Moore and others, and their desire to include practitioners as well into the academic community. Everything I learned and knew in the ethos and values that I incorporated into my own research and teaching all date back to my two chief mentors, or supervisors as we called them when I was in graduate school in England. Two individuals not necessarily well known in the United States, but it's worth pausing for a second to give you a bit of their biography. Professor Hedley Bull was my first supervisor, wrote a very famous international relations theory book, The Anarchical Society. He himself was a philosopher, but he was a philosopher that believed very strongly in the ethos of service to the community and commitment beyond academia in the ivory tower. He was a professor at the London School of Economics, and based on his research and interest in nuclear disarmament, when he was asked to become director of the United Kingdom's disarmament agency, he left academia, came to government, had several years of distinguished service there, and then returned to academia. My Ph.D. supervisor was perhaps one of the most famous, or is one of the most famous living historians of military studies and also of strategy, Professor Sir Michael Howard, a decorated combat veteran of World War II, was injured on the battlefield, came back from the war with an enormous commitment to educating students in the studies of warfare and how to prevent war, and how to engage in the kinds of diplomacy and disarmament activities that would prevent or limit further wars. Shortly after World War II, he founded the Department of War Studies at King's College, London, one of the most distinguished centers in academia in the world today. He also was the founder of what then was known as the Institute for Strategic Studies. It has now blossomed into the International Institute of Strategic Studies. And the point is, they instilled, both Professors Bull and Howard, instilled in their students an ethos and a commitment to scholarship. That scholarship is something that's painstaking, meticulous, careful, and diligent. Just as we heard from Ahmed earlier, that placed a very high premium on students learning from primary sources, from archival sources, not just from secondary sources, but developing the deep expertise that they themselves would need in their subsequent careers. But even more than that, as that brief biographical sketch that I just provided underscored, these were two men committed to building institutions. that would serve their students and serve their communities and society as a whole. And that's very much in the mold of what the Center for Homeland Security at this university seeks to achieve. They also, much like the ethos that Ahmed described, fundamentally believed that for academics to be engaged significantly and meaningfully in public policy, they couldn't ensconce themselves in the ivory tower, that they had to have 2 feet, 1 foot firmly planted in academe and the other foot firmly planted in policy-relevant work, serving practitioners working alongside practitioners and melding those two communities together in order to improve the safety and security of our communities, our nations, and society at large. But I have to say, within the academy, this has always been very controversial, and no, not least so today. Students of terrorism may remember a book that was published in 1988 called Political Terrorism, which was one of the first systematic compendiums of the study of the subject. To give you an example of how challenging the field of terrorism studies is, the two authors of this volume, Alex Schmid and Albert Youngman, surveyed 100 terrorism scholars throughout the world and asked what their definition of terrorism is. I mean, this sounds like a Henny Youngman joke, but they got back 109 definitions from 100 persons, which I think underscores some of the fissures within the field. But one of the main points in their 1980 book that has continued to be repeated was their nostrum that students of terrorism should be, or those who study terrorism should be students of combustion and not firefighters, and that somehow these two things should never blend together, that they would somehow diminish or demean or poison the academic field. Now, interestingly, both men said that in 1988, but within a decade or a bit more, both left academe and entered into government service. Alex Schmid, for many years, was a senior political officer in the United Nations based in Vienna. And Albert Youngman himself, after 9/11, went into the Dutch military intelligence, thus perhaps revising their views on that, I think, very artificial separation. Because after all, those who study counterterrorism and homeland security aren't like philologists or linguists or philosophers. They're talking about real-world issues that have tremendous impact, in which their knowledge can be enormously valuable. And a fault line that has opened up in recent years within terrorism studies specifically is between those who one might call the traditional school of terrorism studies, as exemplified by Alex Schmid, who I said was one of the editors of that 1988 volume, subsequently went on to be one of the directors of the Handa Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at St. Andrews University. And when he became director in 2006, he actively sought to build bridges to the policy community, to both law enforcement, not only in the United Kingdom, but internationally, with government, and also with the intelligence community. And for him, this provided an opportunity to impart the knowledge that he had gained as an academician to a broader community, but also to train and prepare students at St. Andrews University for government service. On the other hand, we have one of the leading figures in the terrorism studies field that's known as critical studies on terrorism. Someone I disagree with profoundly. He's actually a very nice man, though. I've been glad that we could exchange ideas and debate this, but Richard Jackson, who's one of the founding deans or fathers of the critical terrorism studies perspective, takes a completely opposite perspective, and one that I have to say I find is gaining ground in many universities around the world, even in the United States. That somehow the study of a field is impurified or even poisoned by contact with government, that in fact he believes that it raises moral and ethical issues, and believes that scholars should have absolutely nothing to do with government, not least because of the various aspects of the prosecution of the war on terrorism over the past nearly 2 decades. And it's always struck me that that paints a very one-sided picture of, I think, the role that academia can play in addressing real-world real-life issues. And I think no one exemplifies this better than the late Professor Paul Wilkinson, with whom 25 years ago I co-founded the same center that Alex Schmidt went on to direct at St. Andrews University, a pioneering, a towering figure in the field who wasn't afraid to be critical, in this case of his own government and of the war in Iraq in 2007, but even more so back in 1977 had talked about the importance of maintaining the liberal values of the Western liberal democratic state in the struggle of terrorism, and emphasized that academics need to be fully engaged in cooperating with law enforcement, intelligence, and government, educating them as well, but also academics learning about these real-life concerns and helping to develop objective, effective solutions to them. And in that respect, there's often in recent years developed among certain segments in the terrorism studies community an aversion to taking government funding, let's say, for their research. So I think very important initiatives like the Minerva enterprise of the Department of Defense that has funded a wide range of research in very rigorous, competitive grant proposals. These scholars believe somehow has tainted the study of terrorism. Yet, in surveying all the literature that alleges this, it's actually very impoverished in terms of actual empirical evidence that government funding in any way skews, misdirects, influences research. Firstly, there's never been any clarity of the total amount that government spent. And in fact, in an era when private philanthropic organizations and various institutions have less money to spend on public policy research, government-sponsored research on terrorism has emerged as enormously important. There's been no rigorous assessments of the impact so in other words, a lot of these criticisms remain hearsay or anecdotal and without foundation. It's also sometimes alleged that government funding of research makes the research one-sided. But then one has to ask the obvious question. So scholars go out and solicit funding from terrorist organizations in an attempt to right their balance? I mean, putting aside, as I'll get to in the next slide, whether there's some profound moral questions involved in this. And then I think it really sells short what the importance is of this integration of academic research with public policy. What if academic research has helped to save lives in this field? And I think my former colleague from the RAND Corporation, Dr. Colin Clarke, will agree that much of the work that we did when I was at RAND many years ago, our research, I have absolute confidence, helped to save lives and help to better and improve societies and make them more resilient to the threats of terrorism and less likely to overreact or to constrict civil liberties. So that's very important. Secondly, the goal of all public policy research is to make the outcomes better, is to make our policies and our laws much more effective by providing a solid base of analytical research, which is absolutely critical. And also, in many cases, especially in the realm of research that deals with military responses to terrorism, often it is revealed and underscored the importance of non-kinetic, of nonviolent alternatives to countering terrorism as well, and has thus made an enormously significant contribution to the effectiveness of counterterrorism policies. And unfortunately, some of these criticisms, I think, raise issues of moral equivalency, that somehow it's wrong to be cooperative with government. When this kinds of research strengthens, upholds our commitment to liberal democratic values, it's absolutely essential. The critical terrorism scholars talk about the importance of emancipation of aggrieved, subjugated peoples and of understanding the root causes of violence. Again, enormously important, but we have to bear in mind that the practitioners of terrorism are murderers, arsonists, rapists, bombers, criminals. And in many instances, when they have stopped killing and then attempt to explain their violence, they're doing so because they're in jail, for instance, or they've been imprisoned. And then, as I've written in many instances, there is a qualitative difference between violence committed by terrorists and the violence of states that many of these critics point to. And this passage from General James Mattis's recently published book, Call Sign Chaos, I think underscores that. And you see how in General Mattis's memoir, everything and all that he did in the planning for the invasion of Iraq and the ethos that he attempted to impart to the young Marines under his command was designed, as this quote evidences, to prevent the wanton assault on civilians, to preserve civilian lives. I mean, this is lives. This is obviously the complete antithesis of terrorism, which of course focuses on civilian targets and in fact revels in the violence, the destruction, and the subjugation that they bring to civilian populations. So when I look back over my career and I reflect on all the books I've read, all the projects I've been involved in, all the studies I may have been a part of, or at least have read, what stood out to me as the most significant and the most important? And I have to say, there were dozens of commissions that in the old days, much less so now, were convened in Washington that wrote lots of reports that have ended up in file drawers, moldering away, long forgotten. And these three studies are in fact examples of that. But nonetheless, they may be examples of publications and of commission reports that have been forgotten. But you can see the power of their impact, firstly, if they were paid attention to, but secondly, that power when academicians, government officials, law enforcement officers, intelligence officers, military officials or military commanders, representatives of business and high tech are brought together for the common purpose of solving the most pressing contemporary problems of public policy. Let me just talk very briefly about each of them. One was the first report on the Commission of National Security in the 21st Century, known as the Rodman report, after its two directors, former senators, Gary Hart and Warren Rodman. Second one was the Terror 2000 project, sponsored by the United States' Department of Defense Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low Intensity Conflict in 1993, 1999. And then the first report of the advisory panel to assess the domestic response for response capabilities for terrorism involving weapons of mass destruction, known as the Gilmore Commission, in honor of its chairman, Governor James Gilmore of Virginia. And often there's a complaint that the research before 9/11 was somehow substandard or not up to par, and that failed, in fact, to predict some of the events that would become so traumatic and so deterministic in the 21st century. These three reports, all produced during the 1990s, completely demolished that myth as well. So very briefly, let's look first at the Hart-Rodman Commission report, which was issued in September 1999, so 2 years before the 9/11 attacks. Its fundamental conclusion is that mass casualty terrorism would emerge as one of the foremost challenges to the national security of the United States, of CONUS, the continental United States. It concluded that already the functions of law, police work, and military power have begun to blur before our eyes in the face of these new challenges, and only greater cooperation within government would be sufficient to meet them. What they had gotten wrong, but not completely wrong, was that these new threats raised the prospect of an attack on U.S. cities that would entail a mass casualty event. They believed it would be from some weapon of mass destruction, not as we saw on 9/11 from a very clever adaptation of a conventional terrorist tactic, the hijacking of commercial airliners. But of course, as the 9/11 Commission famously said, there was a failure of imagination to imagine that an ordinary hijacking would be turned 4 aircraft into human cruise missiles. So they didn't get 9/11 exactly right with a weapon of mass destruction, but they certainly nailed it in terms of an event of catastrophic consequences, in terms of a casualty rate that was 10 times higher, of a magnitude greater than any previous terrorist incident. And from my perspective, that was the act of terrorism where the line was crossed from what had been a criminal justice problem had been a tactical threat to something that posed strategic implications for a country. This report, again, 20 years ago, was enormously prescient in identifying exactly the problem we see in terrorism today. This flatter, more linear, more networked amalgamation of adversaries communicating with one another through cutting-edge digital means. I mean, this time, no one was really thinking, except for the Hart-Rodman Commission, along the lines exactly that we've seen terrorism evolve to today. When you read the rest of their report, it almost reads like a summary of the past 20 years of events. The challenges and the threats to the Western world and the United States, the question that we asked in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, why do they hate us? And the grievances that would fuel an ongoing campaign of violence that has produced even more deadly terrorist organizations like ISIS, after we've had to contend with, and it's still this ongoing threat from Al-Qaeda. Second conclusion, the U.S. will be called upon to intervene frequently overseas with its military. And if you look at that bottom chart, that's taken from the Smithsonian Institute. It's a very recent study that was released that shows U.S. military deployments on counterterrorism operations to some 80 countries throughout the world, over a third of the world's countries. Their third conclusion, even excellent intelligence will not spare us or prevent all surprises. And whether it was the 9/11 attacks, of course, or indeed the WMD controversy in Iraq, that proved to be true as well. And then finally, they wrote about new foreign crises will occur, replete with atrocities and the deliberate terrorizing of civilian populations. Well, right there you're talking about the Syrian civil war, which has dominated our foreign policy and national security interests for almost a decade now. Similarly, another study, completely lost to the sands of times, that actually I was involved with. It was an effort by the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict in 1992 and 1993 to predict what would terrorism be like in the turn of the century. And those of you in the room are old enough to remember in the 1990s, it seemed like a long time before we'd have the millennium, before the year 2000. It seems like, at least in my experience since 9/11, its time seems to have been compressed in a way that things move much faster and unfold with greater speed than they ever did at the end of the 20th century. This was a very interesting study. It brought together 41 experts from government, from the intelligence community, from the military, law enforcement. One of the members was a former KGB general, Oleg Kalugin, who had recently left Russia and moved to the United States. This study was presented, you can read about it if you want to Google Robin Wright, who now writes for the New Yorker magazine. She used to be a correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, wrote an article about this in 1998, and I remember the title was "The Report They Don't Want You to See." And basically, the report at the time, when it was finished in 1993, was deemed so alarmist and so sensational that both the Secretaries of State and Defense ordered that it not be publicly released and ordered that it be buried. It's fascinating to go back and have a look at this. And if you're a pack rat like myself, you have this all in your basement files. It's very easy to do so. Predicted the rise of religious terrorism and far-right violent extremism. Precisely the dual challenges we face today. Arguably for the first 15 years of the war on terrorism or so, or the first 13 years, I should say, my math is never very good, we faced only one adversary, Al-Qaeda. Between 2014 and now, they were joined by a second major international adversary, ISIS. On top of that, today we face challenges from violent far-right extremists, but also from violent far-left extremists, and even from entirely new categories like the incels, the involuntary celibates, who also practice a variant of male supremacy, engaging in violence as well. Attacks on cities and mass transit was exactly one of the main vulnerabilities they pointed to in Western society. And whether it was the attacks on 9/11, the 2004 simultaneous train bombings in Madrid, Spain, the 2005 simultaneous bombings of London transport, very insightful on those. Terrorist use of chemical agents, which of course has been a huge problem that has fortunately remained confined to Syria and Iraq, but nonetheless what we often see is that Terrorist tactics that are used in conflictual or battlefield situations inevitably migrate to population centers as well. And it called attention to an emergent threat of terrorists perpetrating simultaneous attacks to enhance the fear and intimidation that they seek to achieve in their subjugation of populations. So it concluded future terrorists will find they need ever more spectacular horrors to overcome this American capacity to absorb what previously would have seemed intolerable. We must be prepared to defend against dangers that only a few years ago seemed impossible. But that was deemed too sensationalist ever to be revealed. And then finally, another report that I actually worked very closely on, the first of what were 5 reports by the Gilmore Commission assessing resiliency and preparedness in the United States to deal with a range of terrorism threats to the homeland. Predicted that terrorists would adapt conventional tactics to inflict mass casualties. Now, it didn't predict that they would seize 4 airliners and, as I said a moment ago, turn them into human cruise missiles, but pretty close. Rise of lone actor or leaderless terrorism. I mean, that's precisely the challenge that law enforcement and the intelligence community has been wrestling with, especially since the rise of ISIS, but also with the emergence, or re-emergence, I should say, of violent far-right extremism and this phenomenon known as the incels. Of its 164 recommendations, over 140 were in fact adopted by Congress and instituted into legislation. And here you see 2 years before the 9/11 attacks, the report precisely fastened on the stovepiping and the husbanding of intelligence and information, and recommended that these barriers had to break down if we were to have an effective defense against counterterrorism. And precisely, entities like the Regional Intelligence Center is designed to prevent that husbanding and that stovepiping of intelligence. So in conclusion, I think exactly like the Center of Homeland Security at DeSales University is seeking to achieve, we need a big tent. And we have to, in academia, especially given the gravity of the issue that we study, engage on a regular, ongoing, and intensive basis with practitioners as a two-way street to learn from them and to learn the lessons that they bring to bear in combating a variety of crimes and threats to the homeland, and also to seek to improve the effectiveness and the objective analysis of those measures. A forthcoming study by Jonathan Grossman and Ami Petitzer of the University of Texas on the best means to counterterrorism that's being published in the Encyclopedia of Criminal Justice. Again, a reflection of how cutting edge the Center of Homeland Security is at DeSales, bringing together terrorism studies with criminal justice with Homeland Security. They reached that conclusion that cross-regional, large-scale, interdisciplinary research on these phenomena is the most effective in coming up with real-world practical solutions to these problems, and that the exclusionary stovepiping in academia has to be broken down as it has been in government. Also, too, one of, I think, the problems that I've seen in the 21st century in the study of terrorism is that it's become overly specialized. We have analysts that were extremely knowledgeable about Al-Qaeda or about Boko Haram, about Al-Shabaab, but lack the ability to step back and put these threats in a much broader and systematic picture. This has also occurred in government and intelligence, and it's why both bachelor's and master's degrees, such as those at DeSales University, are so enormously important for people that are involved in the day-to-day business of securing our country and often are focused on very specific threats that might be their analytical lane or might be within their investigative domain. Academic programs enable them to step back and put their very specific, detailed, practical experience into a broader policy perspective that they would otherwise find extremely challenging or difficult to do on their own. So, as Grossman and Petitzer recommended in this, I think, also very cutting-edge article on counterterrorism in a criminology encyclopedia, is that interdisciplinary effort and breaking down those barriers is absolutely essential. And that's why I think the Center for Homeland Security at this university is so timely and so enormously important. In my own experience, having researched terrorism for more than 4 decades, and as those 3 vignettes, I think, of those 3 reports I hope communicated, multidisciplinary research really is the solution. That counterterrorism, homeland security are so complex problems. They cannot be effectively addressed, and in many cases offer practical solutions from only one narrow perspective. It has to be very much this big tent, drawn from diplomats, intelligence and military officers, high-tech industry, human rights scholars, the law enforcement community, and non-governmental organizations. And also, too, I think there has to be greater dialogue and a better understanding between the contending camps in the study of terrorism that doesn't exclude one approach and one that seeks to serve one's community, society, nation more effectively, that breaks down the barrier and breaks down the misunderstanding that these are not tools of government repression or surveillance or any kind of constriction of civil liberties, but rather are designed to address and to effectively meet one of the most formidable national security challenges that we face today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this excellent lecture, Dr. Hoffman. So we are going to have a short 15-minute break, and then we will come back for our panel discussion. Thank you.
ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program will begin shortly. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program will begin shortly.
It's like down here, so I don't know if you can. Okay. Testing 1 2. Testing 1 2. Okay. All right. Where does this go? Just in here? Okay. Thank you.
Thanks for your work. We have to.
CGA.
No?
And that's
However you like. Please.
Maybe going up to the side.
Johnson water?
Oh, great. Yeah, I got it. Great. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to continue with our panel discussion. This is going to be a discussion session with our experts, and at the end of the panel discussion, we are going to take questions from the audience. I would like to start with a question, basically like a trend question. At the time of 9/11, we know that there were around 400 armed and trained Al-Qaeda members. Fast forward to 2019, a recent US military report indicates that there are over 200 Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorists trained and armed in the world right now. We have seen over 55 up to 60,000 foreign fighters joining ISIS in the last 3 or 4 years. Can we make like a fast comparison when it comes to past and the present of Salafi jihadi terrorism and what we should be expecting in the near future?
Okay, I'll start. Well, you know, going back to even the pre-Al-Qaeda period, Abdullah Azzam, who was the ideological father of the movement, always placed a very high premium on outreach and on media and publicity. Now, back then in the 1980s and the 1990s, it was done with glossy magazines and it was done with audio cassettes, for example. That same, I think, approach has unfortunately facilitated a much broader radicalization in the beginning of the century through the advent of the internet and digital communications, and of course in recent years through social media. And this is exactly, I think, the problem that we're up against, is that, look, Al-Qaeda was founded formally or officially in 1988. It didn't carry out its first attack until 3 or 4 years later. It didn't carry out its first significant international terrorist attack until 10 years later, the bombing of the US embassies in East Africa. So there was a slower sort of lag time. But then when you look at a phenomena like ISIS, It went from soup to nuts, or 0 to 120 miles an hour in a very short period of time, exactly as you described, recruiting foreign fighters in the tens of thousands from over 120 different countries, something that was completely unprecedented in the annals of terrorism. And that was because they were very adept at very clever in recognizing the power of social media, just as governments were responding to and coming to grips with terrorist radicalization and recruitment from the internet. We were all of a sudden blindsided with this new phenomenon of social media that caught us flat-footed, and we see how in a very short span of time, ISIS conquered a third of Iraq, created a caliphate the size of England and Wales, amassed a fortune that was also unprecedented in the annals of terrorism. And all of this, I think, by harnessing and relying on the power of communications in the 21st century. So when we look towards the future, this is not something that is stopping. It's continuing to evolve. And I think at root, terrorist organizations, by definition, apart from being violent, of course, they're also revolutionary. They're always about change. And therefore, they're always looking to seize upon developments in our technological world that they can exploit and adapt to further their own malignant, violent ideologies and campaigns.
Yeah, I largely agree with Bruce there. And I think one of the things that I honed in on when looking at the Islamic State was, and there was a lot of hyperbole that surround the rise of the group, right? People said, we've never seen anything like this before. And, you know, we're on stage here with Bruce Hoffman, who's, the man when it comes to studying terrorism. I said, no, go back and read Inside Terrorism. We've seen, elements of this before, but I do think there were a couple of areas where the hype was warranted. One was in financing, as Bruce noted, and I was lucky to spend a lot of time at RAND working on ISIS financing and looking at how much money the group was able to make. At one point, it was making $1 million a day just from oil alone. From smuggling and trafficking oil, including selling it to the Assad regime, its declared enemy. But the other is social media, and I wrote a piece in War on the Rocks with Charlie Winter, where we spent a lot of time going back and forth saying what was so qualitatively different about the way ISIS used social media compared to Al Qaeda, and one of the things we found was that. The group actually specifically recruited individuals with a background in public relations and graphic design and production. And they reached out to them and lured them in from the West, and they gave them incentives. They afforded them with the rank of emir. And so they functioned almost as, this is probably not the best term, as a headhunting firm, which they were in other ways, but to bring in this top talent into the organization and to bring in people that knew how to put out sophisticated, slick videos and to hone in. And it was very targeted, right? It wasn't just this kind of bland approach of, okay, we'll take you and we'll put you here. They were very, very thoughtful about the way they employed the militants in their organization. They had them fill out intake forms, right? So what's your background? What are you good at? And then they deployed them along those lines. So.
Yes.
Firstly, thank you, Ahmed, for the invitation and for everyone at DeSales for having us here. I think the UN and the role of my team is very much built along the values that we already discussed about the new centre and the need for collaboration with the private sector, with the research community. I think building on what you've both said, I do think the method with which Islamic State communicated was important, and it did enable this mass communication and exploitation of social media that we hadn't seen on that scale before. It was a sort of democratization of recruitment, which had previously been done in a much more sort of subtle and hidden, covert way. But I do think we also need to think about the overarching demand as well as the sort of supply element. So we've done a lot of work, and a lot of governments have done a lot of work to stop terrorists using the internet. And I do think it was a substantive difference to what had come before. But I do think, thinking about the demand element of this, that the message was shared in a very broad way, but there was still a desire for people to hear that message and for people to travel in a way that we'd never seen before. So I think, going back to the start of your question and the exponential growth in this problem since 2001, I think it's a good time to reflect, as we're coming up to the 20th anniversary, to reflect on globally what has happened in the war on terror, what mistakes have been made, and what we can learn moving forward. Because I think, considering the huge amount of resources and efforts and manpower that have been dedicated to this fight, and so many successes along the way, there's clearly something that still we aren't achieving. I think some of the things that we at the UN look at are unresolved conflicts, ungoverned or undergoverned spaces where these groups continue to exploit. So I think looking at Iraq and Syria, for example, huge progress has been made, but looking forward 2, 5, 10 years' time, do we think that the problem is dealt with, or is going to re-emerge in perhaps a slightly different way? So it may not be the most optimistic prognosis, but I do think when we're looking back, we also need to look forward as well and think about what we might do differently moving forward.
Actually, I would like to continue from here. Now, when we look back, we see we took out their leaders, including now Bin Laden and al-Baghdadi and several other senior leadership. But looks like even though it helped to deal with these terrorist organizations tactically, decapacitating their leadership did not help in the long run. And looks like maybe it's not going to help with Baghdadi in the long run as well. When I was studying during my PhD dissertation title was Dealing with Terrorism in the Long Run Without or with the least use of force, because I realized from my experience in the field that emotions are highly involved in countering terrorism. When you arrest someone because of their crimes, because of their terrorist activities, all of a sudden I realized that person's relatives, family members, close circles, friends were becoming very open to terrorist propaganda and terrorist recruitment. And even some cases, I saw people being recruited without having the same ideology. They were kind of attracted to the cause because their friends and relatives were either in prison or they were killed. So what can we do to find better ways and mediums of dealing this problem for our futures, where we can at least see some success in the long run in stopping the spread of terrorist ideology and terrorist recruitment, and maybe prevention of future terrorist activities?
I'll start again. Well, one needs a holistic approach. I think that's been, from my perspective, one of the frustrations in the war on terrorism, is that we seize on one tactic and think that's going to provide the answer and catapult us to victory, whether it was killing terrorist leaders, the drone campaign. I mean, all these things are enormously important and enormously effective, but they can't succeed in isolation. It has to be part of a much broader, holistic strategy and approach, which actually David alluded to as well, of ungoverned spaces, democratization, ending corruption. I mean, addressing some of the root causes, but I think your point is that is very important. There's a multiplicity of reasons someone becomes a terrorist that we've never quite figured out, and therefore we have to avoid simplistic solutions and, what seems quick and appealing, like, or not necessarily so quick, but what seems blanketly appealing, like de-radicalization, which I've never been convinced that, firstly, is all that effective. I think disengagement is a much better and more realistic approach than changing someone's mind. But also your point about families is enormously significant as well. I mean, think about it. In the Easter Sunday attacks in Sri Lanka, there were 3 sets of brothers involved. And not only that, some of the brothers' relatives blew themselves up. I mean, it's already, I think, challenging enough for counterterrorism practitioners, whether law enforcement or intelligence, to penetrate or to get informants within a terrorist cell that's made up of like-minded conspirators. But what about when they're part of a nuclear family? And ISIS, I think, this is another, mistake we make in the war on terrorism, is that we often inflate very significant tactical successes into strategic victories. So one of the things that I think was very important is, while some were arguing that for a much longer period now that ISIS was 100% defeated, they also failed to recognize that any terrorist group in decline becomes much more dangerous and tries to adapt and adjust to even the most consequential and effective countermeasures. And I think an example of that was ISIS, for instance, in 2018 in Surabaya, Indonesia. It radicalized 3 entire families, including their children, that they attempted to deploy as suicide bombers. Or even in the United States, in December 2015, husband and wife team were radicalized in San Bernardino. I mean, this, in the annals of terrorism, it's very rare you find husband and wife, but actually deployed on active operations. And this has been, I think, an example of how terrorism is constantly evolving and changing, and why the academy in particular, but obviously also intelligence, law enforcement, and military agencies have to struggle to keep pace with not only the changes, I say struggle because it's not only the changes in terrorism, but as we see today, the diversity of terrorist actors. A few years ago, we had the luxury of just focusing on Al-Qaeda, then it was Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and as I said earlier, now it's violent far-right and violent far-left extremism. It's single-issue terrorists that, unfortunately, in the 21st century, there are more people that have come to embrace terrorism as a solution to whatever grievances animate them.
That I'd like to pick up on, and some things that I think would be particularly salient to some of the practitioners in the room. Bruce mentioned that there's a multitude of reasons why people become terrorists, and he expressed some skepticism about de-radicalization, which I share wholeheartedly, actually. I just think we don't know enough about radicalization. It's a nascent area of study. And if you look at a couple of instances of foreign fighters traveling from Europe to Iraq and Syria to join the Islamic State, it's extremely revelatory. So there was one case where I think it was 4 or 5 guys from the same block or neighborhood in Norway actually went and traveled to join ISIS. And someone asked me, well, how could all of these 5 guys been radicalized? Who's responsible? And I thought to myself, what a strange thing to think that 5 people all had the same degree of intensity in their beliefs and all radicalized. I said, maybe 1 or 2 of them were true believers, and they said, well, why else would they go join ISIS? For kinship, for adventure, out of boredom. The same reason that people join any terrorist group, actually. And I think the familial aspect is particularly important. And you talked about brothers, and so that's one of the things that I've been looking into in terms of ISIS propaganda, along with a researcher named Hararo Ingram. We wrote a piece for the Foreign Policy Research Institute called The Nostalgia Narrative, where we were looking at ISIS propaganda and seeing that this was even before the caliphate was fully destroyed, that they were alluding to the destruction of the caliphate, and that we had built this glorious state and the infidels destroyed it, the filthy West, and we must seek revenge. But beyond that, one of the things we thought about was what happens to, okay, so an 18, 19-year-old left the outskirts of Paris to go join the Islamic State and was killed over there. What happens to his brother who was 12 or 13? How is he treated in the neighborhood where he still lives? Does he have added cachet? Is he kind of looked up to now because he's related to somebody that went and fought? And if so, what does that do to his outlook? Is he then encouraged? And I think there's a lot of probably comparisons to gangs, right? If your older brother is an MS-13, does that give you kind of added cachet in your neighborhood? And so how does ISIS pick up on that online? Are they kind of putting out these martyrdom salutes where they're saying these individuals came from London and Brussels? I've spent some time in Molenbeek, in an area where a lot of people went. It's Belgium has really struggled with this. So how is that treated moving forward, particularly in the virtual space? And what kind of how are we looking at that? Are we seeing this stuff unfold, and are we looking in the right places, engaging that?
Yeah, just to build on a couple of those points. So firstly, in terms of Bruce's comments, I do think terrorism is sort of the ultimate extreme act, and I think a lot of the time it can encourage extreme responses by governments. Making policy in the aftermath of a horrible terrorist attack is probably not the best idea because emotions are high, understandably. And I think globally, looking at the last 20 years, that there's been an understandable response to extreme violent acts to say, well, we need to respond. Not necessarily in kind, but I think infringing on human rights and counterterrorism policies that include use of extrajudicial killings and violence, it's a sort of attempting an understandable emotional reaction to an emotional situation. But I think one of the lessons we've learned is that continuing down that line of a sort of entirely securitized, militarized approach will deliver those tactical victories. But in terms of the strategic victory, looking globally, there's just a real shift, I think, of the Overton window, where Islamic State was the most extreme version of Islamist terrorism that we've seen. And what that means is that Al-Qaeda, in comparison, looks relatively moderate and relatively acceptable. So I think we have to be really careful in our responses to temper our emotions, to think strategically, to think holistically about the right policies and the right approaches. It's not that, I mean, we have to obviously respect human rights regardless, but I think just thinking about that not just as an obligation, as something that gets in the way of our responses, but something that is intrinsic to a successful response. If we start impinging on freedom and liberties to deal with counterterrorism, what impact does that have on the broader picture? But then I think building on what both Colin and Bruce were talking about, we've done quite a lot of work at CTED looking at the role of gender in terrorism and the changing role that women are playing in terrorism. And I think both within the family units, but more broadly, there's been a developing understanding that conventional gender roles and gendered views of what women and men are capable of in the terrorism sphere is just not appropriate, that we have to look at women as independent actors who have rational drivers. We too often, I think, both in the criminal justice and in the investigative thing in the past have maybe assumed that women and their involvement in terrorism was driven by their role as a mother or their role as a wife, but increasingly we have seen women acting as terrorist perpetrators all across the world, including in Southeast Asia. So I think that's one area where we've spent quite a lot of time looking and working with the research community to understand what are the drivers different for men and women? Are the narratives that Islamic State use to recruit women different than men? And I think the answer to that question is that they definitely are. That Islamic State were aware of the different audiences that they were trying to target with their recruitment, and they did specifically target women for specific roles within their organizations. So I think the role of family, the role of children, we're particularly concerned about the thousands of children that are currently detained in northern Syria and what the future holds for them. The conditions that they're living in are atrocious, quite frankly, and I think a future where they're being born into a situation they had no choice around traveling to Iraq and Syria with their parents, and many of them were born there. So I think thinking about that future generation and how they're treated now, as Colin says, how these children are treated now will impact on the future sort of demographic that we're looking at.
And if you want further proof that tactical victories don't amount to strategic success, consider that according to a report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, there's 4 times as many Salafi jihadists today as there were on 9/11. And we've spent $6 trillion conservatively on the global war on terrorism. That's not a great return on investment. I mean, I'm not an economist, but I can do that math.
Thank you. I would like to continue with David. We know UN CTED has a lot of activities to deal with terrorism, particularly from preventive aspects. So could you please elaborate a little bit about the role of the UN and the CTED and what kind of activities you are taking out and what do you see the CTED in the future in terms of fighting against terrorism in the long run?
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess the UN's role in counterterrorism has 3 different prongs. The first one is rulemaking and norm setting, and that typically happens through Security Council resolutions. So over the last 4 to 5 years, there's been over 20 Security Council resolutions that relate to counterterrorism in some way. And what they do is set a very high-level set of rules and norms that governments are expected to obey. So there's been a lot of focus on foreign terrorist fighters. In 2017, the Council passed a resolution which said all member states must do, and there's a list, for example, maintaining terrorist databases and watch lists, introducing greater border security infrastructure. There's a full spectrum of counterterrorism responses. So that's the kind of rule setting, and that's done at political level by member states. And then the 2 other elements are assessment. So my organization's primary role is to go out and visit member states. So in the last year, we've visited about 15 different member states, recently in the UK, we've been to China, we've been to the Philippines. We travel around the world and essentially say, the Security Council sets these rules out. Are you obeying them? Have you introduced legislation to create a national action plan for countering violent extremism? So we do an assessment, we see what the gaps are in their counter-terrorism response, and then the third element is capacity building. And so we visit both high-capacity states and low-capacity states, and the broad idea is that if we're visiting Mozambique at the moment, we know there's a growing terrorist threat there posed by Islamic State affiliate. What gaps are there in their counter-terrorism response, and then what can be done to fill them? So the other parts of the UN system will say, we can introduce a program that will deal with your border security issues. We can introduce a program to create a national strategy. So that's the overarching view, is that we essentially look globally across all 193 member states and see what their gaps are in their counter-terrorism response and see if we can fill them. And then I think relevant to the new program here, we've had a particularly big focus in the last 2 or 3 years around evidence. So both digital evidence, which I know we've talked about, and thinking about the global response to the challenge of digital evidence. We work a lot with different internet companies, both big and small. And we know that small platforms are increasingly used by terrorist groups to host content, for example. So we work with companies that are basically a one-man band, run out of their apartment, and they get a request from the Turkish government, they get a request from the American government, they get a request from the Russian government to take content down, to share evidence. How you do that when you don't have a legal team, you don't understand your responsibilities, you don't understand what form the information needs to be shared. So we've done a lot of work doing capacity building with those smaller technology companies to say, if you have a request for digital evidence or for takedown, this is how you can respond. And then the other element, which I think is really important in the current context, is around battlefield or military evidence. So in large parts of the world where terrorism is prevalent, we're essentially talking about a conflict zone. So conventionally, when we think about counter-terrorism, we think about criminal justice, we think about law enforcement being the first responders, but in large parts of the world, in West Africa, in East Africa, in Southeast Asia, in South Asia, and of course in the Middle East, the military are on the front line of counter-terrorism. So they're raiding villages, they're targeting compounds, they're attacking training camps. And in doing so, they're doing it in a military, with a military mindset on. And I think what we're trying to do is to make them think in that context about criminal justice and about evidence. So a lot of the foreign fighters that were detained in Iraq, or the local fighters that were detained in Iraq, when the military goes in, there's a huge wealth of digital devices, there's fingerprints, all of the conventional criminal justice things that you would think about as evidence are just not a priority for the military in that space. So we're about to launch a big set of guidance around military evidence to essentially say, thinking about terrorist threats to the future and the increasing amount of conflict, how can we get a military actor in Iraq to detain someone, generate evidence and share that with authorities, not just in one country, but all around the world. So we know our UN colleagues have recently contributed to a case in Finland where a foreign fighter was able to be prosecuted successfully because of evidence that was found in Iraq by military actors. So that's the kind of broader picture which I think is particularly relevant to the new program. That the evidentiary challenge is a really big one when we're talking about transnational actors, and I think all of those different processes, if a military actor in Iraq is detaining someone, they maybe have to have a brief of evidence that's going to be used in multiple jurisdictions who have different rules and different regulations. So it's a real challenge to think globally when we're a relatively small team, but it's I think the UN's role as a sort of force multiplier and a convener is something that we really value.
And these issues are linked, right? So you earlier described some of the detention camps where people are suffering and lingering and something needs to be done. Many European nations are reluctant to bring these individuals home. One of the main reasons is because they're fearful they won't be able to prosecute people because they lack that evidence, right? Exactly. So it's all connected. If we get better at digital forensics and being able to produce the type of evidence needed, they may be more willing to take them home and then alleviate that issue. So I see this as all kind of part and parcel of the same problem, which is another reason why programs like this are absolutely essential.
Yeah, I think it is that interconnectedness that's really key. I think a lot of what we've done in the last 5 years is honestly scrabbling to respond to a problem that was much bigger than anyone expected with the foreign fighters. And so, prioritizing border security, information sharing, intelligence sharing, having these database and watch lists so that when individuals are traveling from Turkey overland via multiple borders, how do authorities get detected that these individuals are suspected foreign fighters? So I think, a lot of what we're doing is fixing a problem is already changing into something else. So I think this is part of the broader problem that Bruce highlighted, that in terms of the evolution, we're always fighting yesterday's problem, but I do think a lot of these initiatives will hopefully be valuable across different conflicts and across future problems as well.
And making sure they're not just mere buzzwords, right? How many times do we hear intelligence sharing, cooperation between law enforcement, good governance, counter-corruption, right? But how do you actually do those things, and do you have the tools in place to empower people at the tactical level to go out there and do those things?
Thank you. So I would like to also talk a little bit about the concept of dealing terrorism, particularly from the perspectives of law enforcement. For years, as a former counterterrorism police chief, we always maybe still thinking that the success was the numbers of the arrests we do in countering terrorism. We kind of brag about how many terrorists we locked up, but it is like an endless game. The numbers never diminish. And also, from preventive perspective, when we think about recruitment, radicalization, and more importantly, prevention of future terrorist activities, we kind of lack an understanding of carrying out these activities before things happen. Instead, we kind of opt for dealing afterwards. So, in another word, maybe we are not at least one step ahead of terrorists when it comes to dealing with their future activities. We know there are a lot of CVE and PVE type programs, but what I feel like, I think we are missing a big picture or an understanding of dealing terrorism when it comes to radicalization and recruitment. Why aren't we focusing on stopping, for example, recruitment? Oftentimes, the law enforcement and intelligence agencies are aware of whom are being approached by different terrorist organizations for the future recruitment purposes. And why aren't we going to those individuals, try to prevent their recruitment? Instead, we are waiting for a criminal activity so that we can arrest them. Do we need like a change in our perceptions?
I would say, to begin, you mentioned that sometimes you brag about the number of people locked up, right? And say, here, look at this metric, when really that's just counting. That's not a metric of success, right? And if you think about, so I've studied, part of my academic training is in transnational organized crime, and I've looked a lot at kind of drug seizures and stuff. And a DEA agent once told me that the rule of thumb was that they get, I think it was 10% of whatever's coming across the border or something. So when you put all the stuff on the table and say, look, we have a record seizure, doesn't that just mean that more things are coming across? And so I wonder if it's the same with terrorism. And it's really difficult because how do you count those that don't become terrorists? How do you know that you're succeeding, right? The so-called dogs that don't bark. How many people did we dissuade from becoming this? But again, to go back to the people in this room and to focus on recruitment, I think, local security forces are going to be the ones that probably have the best idea of who's most vulnerable, right? They're the ones working in those communities on a daily basis and know who might be most susceptible to the lure of these violent ideologies. And, how far separated are they from national level policymakers? Or conversely, how closely intertwined are they where, that local beat cop or someone in the neighborhood is going to be able to even be aware of what the national level policy is? Is the group that's recruiting this individual designated as a terrorist group? So in other words, is it even illegal for them to join the group? In the case of the Islamic State, maybe yes. In the case of another group, it may not be. So I think there's a whole basket of issues just in that one little piece that you mentioned.
Yeah, and just briefly on the community policing aspect, I remember, so my own counter-terrorism career started just after the 7/7 attacks in London, and I remember speaking to one of the detectives who'd been working on the case in Yorkshire and essentially saying that after the event, when they spoke to various members of the community and neighbours of the chief plotter, a number of them mentioned, oh, we had noticed various unusual things happening in that house and around that house, and they actually mentioned that the bushes and the hedge outside the house had turned a strange colour as a result of the chemicals that were being poured down into the water system. But at that stage, there was just no awareness of what kind of activity they should be looking out for, and no one for them to raise that issue with. So I do think the community policing aspect that Colin highlights is really important in terms of those behaviours and indicators of something suspicious. But I do think the broader question around recruitment and radicalisation is a really challenging one, because so much of counterterrorism is already operating essentially in the pre-crime space. And if we continue to slide, as terrorist attacks can be launched in a much quicker time frame, in a much more simplistic way, if you start going further and further across into that pre-crime space of radicalisation and recruitment, you have to create new laws and new offences to say that these things are illegal, which has happened in a lot of parts of the world. But building safeguards. And safeguards, but building a case on somebody's radicalisation and recruitment is very challenging. And so I think as we go further and further down this space of having started in the sort of reactive, there's been a terrorist attack, what do we need to do, to the let's stop the recruitment in the first place, it's very challenging, which I think is why the focus a lot of the time has been on the online space and a lot of the, and places or locations where individuals have been radicalised, whether it was religious institutions or gyms or whatever else. So I think it is a very challenging area.
Well, in some respects, I think, sadly, almost 2 decades into the war on terrorism, we're going backwards because, for instance, in the aftermath of some of the politically motivated mass shootings that have happened in the United States, once again, we embrace a simplistic solution. Well, it's mental illness. And that's, may account for some terrorism, but not all terrorism. I mean, mental illness and terrorism isn't mutually exclusive, but neither are they mutually dependent upon one another. So I think we need a sober understanding of the problem rather than emotionally reacting or jumping, as I said earlier, to single solutions. I think in the US, there's another problem, is no one really owns the counter-radicalization anyway. I mean, it's done on such a piecemeal and uncoordinated basis that it's not surprising that it's very difficult to point to effectiveness. But I think, as both Colin and David has said, and it's absolutely right, I mean, law enforcement officials need information, whether it's to solve ordinary crimes or to detect radicalization or terrorist proselytizing or recruitment. And often they're going to be the most familiar with communities, hopefully have the best relations, because after all, I mean, look at the motto that's on many law enforcement agencies: to protect and serve the population. So this is, again, where I think education from places like the Center for Homeland Security is so invaluable, and also in supplanting police training as well, but understanding that just as on the side of the Jefferson Memorial, that, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, and that we have to understand that as terrorist threats are constantly evolving, that even during periods of lulls, we can't afford to lose a lot of the expertise that we've built up or to compromise on a lot of the momentum that we have gathered. It certainly exists. My point is that it just has to be better coordinated and better directed.
And just very quickly on that, I do think, it's very easy to galvanize a response when the threat is very clear and present, and it was very easy to galvanize a response when ISIS had its caliphate and was ruling large parts of Iraq and Syria. But there is a real tendency within public policy in every sphere that if you feel like a problem is dealt with and a threat is reduced, that you move on to something else that's more pressing. And so we've definitely found, talking to different governments, that there is a bit of a counter-terrorism fatigue, that this issue has been a massive priority for a few years. The problem has been dealt with to some extent, and now maybe it's a time to move on to something else. So it's that ongoing vigilance question that is really, really difficult to maintain.
Thank you. Yes, Paul has a question. Please.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
So, yeah, I've analyzed hundreds or actually thousands of pieces of digital evidence over the past 20 years. And you guys I hear a little bit talk about local, but you're talking more about global. So when we analyze a hard drive or a mobile device, it's amazing what we learn about an individual when we analyze that device, right? So when the military assets are out in the field taking taking computers and phones. Are they analyzing that to, when we're analyzing devices, we can say, hey, you know, we're seeing a pattern here in Allentown, Pennsylvania, that might help. But is anyone analyzing those hard drives to learn about their methodologies? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yes.
I think so. So I can speak in general terms. I think we're a lot better at that now. If you look at some of the open source commentary surrounding the Baghdadi raid, there was a lot of focus on what we would call pocket litter, right? So what are those things that he had with him, and kind of any kind of digital devices that were seized from the home, and what does that tell us? I was very lucky while at the RAND Corporation to be able to work on a project on ISIS financing. The project itself was classified, but we were, in general terms, we were able to get ISIS ledgers from the battlefield that were taken off the battlefield, translated and given to us, so we could actually dive into their finances and look at what the trends were, and so that was totally invaluable, because there's no better way to learn how this group makes money than to look at their treasurer's notebook, which we had. So I think we're much better aware of that, and I'm sure Bruce could speak to some of the things around Abbottabad that happened with bin Laden. But I think that's now very high on our list when we do go after key leaders, things that we're looking for to exploit, because everybody today in today's day and age is using electronics, and I think data is currency now.
Analyze that data so we know how they're radicalized.
Yeah, I think the challenge is how far down does that get pushed, right? So like, does that stay in a kind of stovepipe or silo, or is that pushed all the way down? I remember after the Brussels March 2016 attack, the Belgians came under a lot of fire because of all the links back to Belgium, and I think there's 19 different administrative police districts in Brussels alone, and there's language differences and all these different kind of issues going on there. And anecdotally, I think things have gotten better, but until there's that forcing function, you want things to get better before something like that happens, right? But I think, as we saw with the lead up to 9/11, there's egos involved, there's rice bowls involved, right? There's all the things, if there's any business students in here that study organizational theory, right? All of the things that are wrong with bureaucracies that we know about, but how do you actually have the leadership that pushes the incentives to become better at that?
Because we want to help.
Yeah, no, I get it.
I think it's a really great question, because I think our current project is very much focused on turning that information into evidence, but obviously military actors are already exploiting that for their own intelligence purposes, whether it's strategic or tactical. But I think it is that information sharing piece, which is always compounded by the bureaucratic issues, the classification issues. I think one of the things we've also stressed is wherever possible, for the things that Bruce was talking about earlier, about that relationship between academia and policy and practitioners, is to say, you may not have the time or capacity to analyze the data you've accumulated from all of these cases, whether criminal or investigative, but academics would love to get their hands on that data. And obviously, again, classification issues, access issues, vetting issues, but the closer the relationship to allow people who are experts in radicalization, for example, to have access to that kind of data and to be able to share their findings in a sort of unclassified academic environment is a huge opportunity. And I think different countries are doing it to a greater or lesser extent, but because this problem is global, it has to be, there's so many different actors at so many different levels. It's a real challenge to make sure it gets to the people who need it.
And we have new tools, machine learning and AI tools, that can help us deal with that data inundation issue, I think.
Well, unfortunately, your excellent question shows why we're going to be fighting this war on terrorism for at least another decade, if not more. Because don't forget, the Intelligence Reform and Anti-Terrorism Act of 2004, which created the National Counter-Terrorism Center, was in part created precisely to address this problem, was to have an element that was part of the intelligence community, but not strictly speaking of it, like the CIA or NSA or so on, and that would link up with state and local and push that information down. Now, at a time when Congress was able to focus on other issues, I know certainly at the time, over a decade and a half ago, this was a real priority. But obviously, your question suggests that, in theory, it's a priority, great idea, but as the war on terrorism, I think at some points it was actually probably more active than it is now, but also getting that information to Department of Homeland Security and pushing it down to the regional intelligence centers was always what was envisioned. And I think this is in part a reflection of how complex the threat gets and how overwhelmed agencies that have been focused on one dimension of it find that they have to now be multi-dimensional. But also, I think it's the price or the penalty for relaxing our vigilance and not maintaining those flows of information that is absolutely critical.
Thank you. So with that, I would like to open the podium to questions. We have 2 microphones in the hall, so please feel free to approach to the microphones for questions.
Just one at a time, please.
Can you comment on China a little bit? They don't seem to be as much of a target, the Far East versus the West, and the hate isn't directed at them. And does China, do we know that they bear any responsibility or willingness to help fight the war? Do they see it as their issue or somebody else's issue?
You're talking about China's role in the global war on terrorism?
Yeah, yes.
So I wrote a piece in Slate maybe a month ago where actually I looked at, and there was a New York Times article, I think just last week, that reveals some documents that were passed to the Times about what's going on in concentration camps in Xinjiang province in northwest China with over 1 million Uyghurs that have been imprisoned there. And Xi Jinping has actually borrowed from language in the global war on terrorism to justify some of the abuses that the Chinese have been perpetrating. There's been almost near radio silence from the international community outside of the UN and others that have actually had the courage to speak up. All Muslim countries have been silent, and it just shows you kind of how China wields its economic power to intimidate and really bully others. So I think and I'm sure my colleagues can speak to this as well, but I think what we're seeing in China right now is a travesty, and frankly the fact that it's not getting more attention is mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, I mean, I probably have to be slightly more diplomatic in my response to this one, but it's suffice to say that they are actively involved globally. I think their focus has been very local and to an extent regional. A big priority for them, unsurprisingly within their broader political context, has been around terrorist use of the internet and limiting access to materials. I think other parts of the UN system, as Colin says, have raised significant concerns around Xinjiang province and what essentially amounts to a large-scale internment of a part of the population. So I think there's significant and obvious human rights concerns around that approach in the war on terror, and I'll probably leave it at that.
I think, unfortunately, it's a reflection of some of the serial denigration we see of the Western liberal state these days, and sort of the adulation of dictatorships and of their methods, because diplomats from the PRC go around and say that China has found the answer to counterterrorism and are actually seeking to export their approach, which is, as Colin described, which is basically to incarcerate 1 million people, regardless of any complicity or guilt, but just because of their religion and their ethnicity. So I find, China's approach very worrisome, because it's seductive to lots of other countries that face these threats, that you can just embrace mass incarceration as an answer, as a highly simplistic answer, which I think completely defies what we've been discussing the entire morning, is the complexity of this threat and why there has to be a multiplicity of approaches along entire, interagency, but also academe, business, high tech, NGOs, and so on.
Just one last part, because I think technology is something that we can't leave out of this discussion. And while we think from a law enforcement and counterterrorism perspective of all the good things that biometrics and surveillance can do, you can easily see how this is misappropriated by an authoritarian regime. And as Bruce mentioned, I think they're seeking to export that to other authoritarian and non-authoritarian regimes, and basically say, hey, the proof's in the pudding, this works. Look at the number of terrorist attacks. They've gone down dramatically. And if you're willing to disregard human rights, you can do this too. That's very palatable to a politician that wants to run on, a hard line on security. And so it's very scary when you think about advances in technology that can be used for evil, not for good.
Thank you. So I think a few of our questions, students want to ask questions. Yeah, please. Don't be shy.
When we talk about the MO of both ISIS and Al-Qaeda, we see that ISIS is more focused on like short and one-off attacks, whereas Al-Qaeda is long-term and planning. Which do you guys view as more of a strategic threat? And are you scared that since we haven't really seen a large-scale attack from Al-Qaeda lately, do you think that there is one in the planning? Do you think that we could see that happening sooner than later?
I'll start. Well, I think you're quite right. I think Al-Qaeda does pose the longer-term strategic threat. I mean, after all, Al-Qaeda celebrated its 31st anniversary last August, and I think as a terrorist organization, you don't get to survive over 3 decades in operation without this enormous capacity to adapt and adjust even to the most consequential countermeasures directed against you, but also to develop a sense of resiliency that's predicated on long-range planning. I mean, that said, I think, fortunately, our own vigilance in this country, and certainly working with the international community, for the time being, I think, has diminished the likelihood of another 9/11 type of attack. So even as sometimes pessimistic as I am about the war on terrorism, or critical in terms of not anticipating the new threats that are arising, I think we've been enormously effective in preventing another 9/11 type of attack. But your question's a very good one, because I would argue that at least for the past 4 years or so, or 5 years perhaps, since the declaration of the ISIS caliphate, Al-Qaeda has been sitting back and watching as ISIS consumes all our attention, continues to exhaust our counter-terrorist efforts, to create deep divisions and polarization within our own society and our own political system, and waits for what it sees as an opportunity to strike again in some fashion. Again, I would be surprised if it's on the level of a 9/11 attack. But then, of course, if you had asked me that question on September 10th, 2001, I probably would have given the same answer, which goes back to my point that in a struggle against an enemy that had shown itself to be quite protean, to be quite resilient, we can't afford to relax our vigilance, and we have to be very careful. All the measures that we have put in place that have been so successful over the past 18 years in preventing a repeat of 9/11 are perishable. As we degrade those, as our attention shifts quite naturally to other vital and critical national security threats, we have to be careful not to throttle back the progress that we've achieved in the war on terrorism and in diminishing the capabilities of terrorist groups to launch 9/11-like attacks.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I know both of you have written a lot on this issue. I think in many ways, whilst they are rival organizations, for the last 5 years, the actions that ISIS have been taking are, broadly speaking, actions that are supportive of Al-Qaeda's strategic aims. Yeah. So in many ways, they haven't really needed to do those types of attacks when you have an organization that shares many of the same beliefs and ideas doing exactly that very effectively. So it will be fascinating to see how it evolves. Obviously, in Syria, the evolution has been, so far at least, from Jabhat al-Nusra and its successor organizations, has been away from externally focused terrorist violence and towards governance and relative moderation. And it will be very interesting to see whether that pathway is one that other Al-Qaeda affiliates follow or not. So yeah, I would agree with the underlying part of the question was that we do have to remain vigilant, but I do think, as Bruce says, they've played a very patient, long game, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, ISIS successes have meant that Al-Qaeda, in comparison, looks relatively moderate and relatively sensible. And just speaking personally, looking forward, the idea of a territory-holding governance model for Al-Qaeda and its affiliates, where they swear away from any external action is one that I don't know whether the international community or certain governments will be prepared to live with that, in having seen what ISIS is capable of in a sort of caliphate model.
So I think, first of all, very astute observation. You have some smart students here. That's a good thing. Bruce was, I think, the one who used the term quietly and patiently rebuilding in the cipher brief, and something that I think about when I think about Al-Qaeda quite often. And to get to Dave's point on, Al-Qaeda in Syria now, trying to portray itself as this, you call them relatively moderate. I mean, that's a scary thing to think about, that we could even be using the term moderate for the group that perpetrated the 9/11 attacks. In 2017, I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs on this exact topic, and I think that, and you don't get to choose the titles. I mean, maybe Bruce does, but I'm not at that level where they choose the titles for you, and it was called The Moderate Face of Al-Qaeda, and I got hate mail. I mean, by people who clearly didn't actually read the piece, but saw that, I was trying to, or thought I was trying to soft pedal what Al-Qaeda was. And actually, it's the fact that they're getting involved in grassroots governance is very frightening to me. And this is something I've talked a lot with Barack Mendelsohn about, which is, could you see a scenario in 5-10 years where Al-Qaeda is baked into the politics of Syria? And look no further than the evolution of Lebanese Hezbollah. If you were to say in 1983 or 1984 that this is a group that would be, keeping its arms, being a transnational terrorist network, but also controlling seats in Lebanon's parliament, people would have told you were crazy. But here we are in 2019, and that's absolutely the truth. Could you end up in a similar situation in Syria, where Al-Qaeda hardliners actually have a say in politics? It's a talk about duration and longevity. I mean, that's essentially assuring that. So I think things have taken a turn for the worse in Syria. Obviously, it looks like Assad is close to solidifying a victory there, but Idlib remains the kind of big outlier.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just realized it's incredibly depressing. Doom and gloom.
So one more question. We have time for one more question. Please.
So we've learned from past spreading of ideology and how it spread faster and wider through war and conflict on terrorism. How can we combat terrorism or the ideology where we see that physical war and violence is spreading this, especially with the increase of technology and social media to spread propaganda? And how can we as students in Homeland Security learn about these issues and be one step ahead?
Okay. Save the easiest one for last. Huh?
Well, I think one of the main reasons is learning from the mistakes of the past and not replicating them. And at least historically, that, to my mind, has been one of the biggest problems in counterterrorism. It's that terrorist organizations, to survive, especially as long as Al-Qaeda has, as we were just discussing, have to be, quote-unquote, learning organizations and have to adapt and adjust to the most effective countermeasures. I think, unfortunately, is there's often a habit, it's not unique to the United States, of declaring victory or of interpreting a period of quiescence of terrorism as the elimination of a threat, or that it's gone away. So I think first and foremost is learning from the patterns of the past, that terrorism surfaces and emerges in response to often an idiosyncratic combination of developments that are often very difficult to predict. But the pattern of the rise, though, has, I think, given rise to certain visible behaviors in terms of the radicalization process, the recruitment process, the need to have finances, and we need to be better at detecting and interdicting those fundamentals, and then avoiding the mistakes of the past of widening terrorist wars and broadening the focus that then dilutes the overall effort, to adapting a very forward-looking outlook that seeks to anticipate how terrorism may evolve, how terrorism never occurs in a vacuum. It always reflects what is ongoing in society, and just the same that all these social messaging apps were emerging, and it was until ISIS, no one really imagined how ISIS could possibly harness those capabilities to exponentially enhance its appeal and strengthen its brand. We have to be very focused on the next new thing, or the next big thing in digital communications and artificial intelligence, in technology generally, and understanding and appreciating how the benefits that that brings to our society can also be harnessed for nefarious purposes by our adversaries, and to put into place measures to effectively deal with that rather than always being locked into the cycle of response.
Well, just briefly, and yeah, definitely a great question, a tricky one to answer. I think focusing on you as students, I think building on things we've said already today, I think narrow specialism and focus is a crucial part of counterterrorism. But I think, as we've all discussed, so many of these issues are interconnected and interdisciplinary. So I think, based on what we've heard today about the new program, I think that sounds like a really valuable aspect of that it's not just a narrow focus. I think the other thing, building on what Bruce said, is technology. And I think there's a massive disconnect in age and understanding of technology between senior policymakers and the individuals that are predominantly responsible for terrorism. So, I think with the rise of ISIS and their use of social media, far too many people in the policy space do not understand how these apps use themselves. They're not technologically savvy, partly through a generational thing. So I think as young, hopefully young practitioners moving forward, I think having that connection to what's happening amongst young people is vitally important. I think a lot of the time people talked about how slick and how professional, how incredible what ISIS were doing on social media was, and it certainly was a marked difference to what we'd seen before. But I think an understanding of what's capable on social media networks, producing videos, all of these things that I think students of your generation take for granted are things that senior policymakers, it's just an unfamiliar territory. So I think integrating those insights about essentially what young people think and how they think and what they're doing is a really, really important part of evolving in a CT response.
You asked how we can stay one step ahead. Again, not to be the bearer of bad news, I don't think it's about staying one step ahead. I think it's about not being 5 steps behind. I think this is, it's a mitigation issue. We're never going to completely defeat terrorism. It's a tactic as old as mankind, and I think that's problematic with the way that we even discuss it. We talked about this global war on terrorism because we declared war on a tactic, right? It would be like declaring war on Blitzkrieg in World War II. It makes no sense. And as Americans, we like to declare war on things because it makes us feel better, right? The war on drugs, how's that going? The war on poverty, the war on gluten. For the record, I'm for that one. Right? But I think as students, what can you do? It's about staying aware of trends. And this was just a kind of a sidebar that I was having with Bruce before our panel, and that I was talking to Dave about a couple of weeks ago when we were in the Middle East together, which is, what are those ideologies in the future, in the very near future, that might inspire people to engage in acts of political violence, and thinking through those, whether what those are. And I think as young people that are studying the subject, you probably have a lot better sense of what those are, or you'll know, or you'll recognize them before we will, because you'll see them, and you'll notice anomalies or weird things that are happening on Snapchat or on other kind of platforms, right? When you watch, congressional testimony and you see some senators questioning Mark Zuckerberg, I often wonder if these people even use email. Tell me more about this Facebook thing, right? And they're so disconnected from what's actually happening that it's scary. And so I think, not to be corny or cliche, but you guys are the future, the students here, if the questions you've asked are any indication, it's a bright future, but it is a dangerous world, and I think programs like this at DeSales are going to be critical to keeping us safe as Americans.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you for being here. We would like to continue with concluding remarks. I would like to invite Dr. Colin Clarke, Senior Research Fellow at the Soufan Center, for his concluding remarks. If you want, you can go back. If you want, you can sit. It's up to you.
Stay.
Okay.
So can I actually, well, I can keep this on, right, and then just not use the microphone. So I'll talk a little bit about, I think, well, first let me start with, grab my notes, and start by appropriately thanking everybody that I'd like to thank. First, Ahmet, I'd really like to thank you for the invitation. We've written a couple of things together, and we've collaborated on a few pieces in foreign policy and elsewhere, and I've just got the utmost respect for you and for your work, so it's been a pleasure. To Father Jim, to Dr. Moore, Brother Dan, Dr. Blumenstein, thank you so much for the hospitality. This has really been a great experience, and I mean that. And then also to have Dave here, who's become a friend over the last year, and to be here with Bruce. Again, not to embarrass him, but some people grow up idolizing Michael Jordan. When you study terrorism, you idolize Bruce Hoffman. So it's really just surreal to be here and to be participating in this event alongside. Before I get started, I'll give you some of my background and other things that are that really resonated with me being at a place like DeSales. So I went to a high school called Chaminade High School, so I'm Marianist trained. Loyola College in Maryland, so trained by the Jesuits as well. And studied for a semester at University of Galway, and I heard someone mention Galway as a potential study abroad, although studying might be a bit generous for what I was doing there when I was 21, but either way, I was there actually studying the IRA and the Good Friday Agreement, and my first day of class happened to be September 11th, 2001, and so I was always interested in terrorism, but after that, being from a Marine Corps family, shifted my focus to what was happening in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and elsewhere. And I also have Philly roots. My in-laws are originally from the Northeast, from Ronhurst area, and then kind of made the migration up to Bucks County. And I have a law enforcement connection as well because my mother-in-law is a secretary at Northampton Police Department, Northampton in Bucks County. So all these other connections. And one of my prize students at Carnegie Mellon is a DeSales grad. His name's Adam Dessian. And he's in the Masters of Information Technology Strategy. He's my TA as well, and you'll be happy to know that he's got a job lined up at the Pentagon to be doing cyber work for them. So you're producing top talent. Keep doing that. For the students, one of my jobs, I have several, is at the Soufan Center, working for Ali Soufan. And so please keep in touch because we're always looking for bright interns in the summer months. And so I'd be happy to serve as a sounding board there. So this is a book called After the Caliphate that I finished and published this summer. So I've been thinking a lot about the Islamic State. I look at the history of the global jihadist movement, building on the work of Bruce and other scholars, look at Al-Qaeda, the evolution there, and the book kind of traces how we've seen this movement evolve over time into Al-Qaeda, into its affiliates and franchises, to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then ultimately to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And actually gets right up to about the point where the caliphate is destroyed and tries to look ahead and think about what happens next. And I think we're there. We're trying to grapple with what happens next. And Dave alluded to this a little bit when he talked about Al-Hol and some of the things we're seeing in Syria. That's probably giving a second life or a third or fourth, whatever you want to call this ISIS 3 or 4.0 to the Islamic State. And then I've been focusing a lot on the affiliate groups lately because I think if we do see a shift in the center of gravity, there's some places that I'm particularly worried about the Islamic State kind of growing. And we saw a similar evolution with Al-Qaeda as the core receded or became more challenged with spending time in operational security and surviving the drone wars. We saw other groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula become operationally capable and focus on attacks on aviation. And so that's kind of one of the things I've been looking at. I look at the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, which I think is going to be a major concern right now. with the shift and the movement of foreign fighters, and then Southeast Asia as well, and the Philippines. And I wrote a piece with Zach Abuza just a month or two ago looking at some of the trends in Southeast Asia, not only in the Philippines, but also in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. So it's a truly global movement. I just mentioned and kind of ticked off a number of the affiliate groups. I forgot to mention West Africa, which is also an area of great concern. And the question becomes, which of these affiliate or franchise groups ultimately outpaces the core group in Iraq and Syria, which will continue to remain strong, no doubt, even after the death of Baghdadi. But thinking ahead and trying to think through this, and one of the reasons that I initially reached out to Ahmet to write together was because I see now and have seen for some time Turkey playing a really critical role in providing kind of safe haven and sanctuary to the Islamic State. And I think when we talk about terrorist groups, our kind of model, or maybe mine anyway, of a failed state or a place that's an ungoverned space. I think the better term is probably alternatively governed space, right? No place is truly ungoverned. It's alternatively governed. We just don't like who's governing it, or we don't recognize that form of governance. But thinking through Afghanistan as this kind of safe haven or sanctuary and this kind of archetype failed state. But I think actually a place like Turkey is far more dangerous. So here there's geographic proximity, so it's close to the battlefield, and it's plugged into all of the trappings of globalization that serve as force multipliers for a terrorist group: transportation, communications, the illicit financial system, right? And clearly the leadership there has chosen to look the other way and allow the Islamic State to kind of crop up. It's one of those, I think part of it's a legacy of conflict, right? Turkey has been focused on fighting the Kurds for so long that even in the face of a clear and present danger, they're still focused on what they saw before them. And I think back to the attack in Sri Lanka, right? Even when the intelligence was handed to the authorities, they still couldn't focus on anything but the Tamil Tigers, right? And I think that's a huge issue going forward, and one that's likely to play itself out in other conflict zones throughout the world. But what I've been doing lately is trying to think through some future terrorist threats, which is kind of what I alluded to in my final remark on the panel. A couple of years ago, right before I left the RAND Corporation, we did a project for the Office of Director of National Intelligence looking at kind of future terrorist threats and really trying to force myself to think creatively about what might motivate individuals and groups to engage in acts of political violence. And there's a couple of things up here. Starting on the far left, does anyone know who that is? Does he look familiar at all? I guess it's probably better if you don't know who this is, right? So that's a picture of Elliot Rodger, who is, I guess, kind of hailed by the incels, right, the involuntary celibates. He went on a shooting rampage in California. He recorded a very kind of dark video, who's frustrated about his lack of success with women. And he's become, he looks like that, not because we're here at DeSales, and I I'm trying to connect with people, because in the online community, he's hailed as a saint. And they call him the Supreme Gentleman, Elliot Rodger. And he's served as this kind of galvanizing figure for the incel movement, which is a very, very strange movement, but one that we shouldn't take lightly, and one that's got a massive online footprint. And so that's something, the fact that we failed to anticipate something like that, it just shows me that we've got to be more creative in thinking through motivators of violence. The next is a report that we did for the Soufan Center on White Supremacy Extremism. And I don't mean to suggest in any way that this is a new threat. In fact, it's probably one of the oldest. And Bruce has written about this in Inside Terrorism and has documented probably the most comprehensive collection on the far right, which is, I think, that kind of broader umbrella that includes anti-government extremists. And I would imagine in this part of Pennsylvania, so I live in Pittsburgh and was affected quite closely by the Tree of Life attack. In fact, I was living in Squirrel Hill at the time when that attack on the synagogue took place. But that in this part of Pennsylvania, there's quite a bit of sympathy and subpopulations that do sympathize with with violent white supremacy. And I was talking to Cynthia Miller-Idris, who's one of the top scholars in this, and she's done a lot of work in and around this part of the state, documenting that. And so I think it's back with a vengeance. In fact, it never went away, quite frankly, but we've seen it morphing in different ways, and the report actually looks at some of the transnational dimensions of violent white supremacy. There's this there's a myth that it's a domestic issue, right? We call it domestic terrorism, and that it's a local or parochial concern only. And that's not true. And frankly, we've seen that with connections to Ukraine. There's a group called the Azov Battalion that's kind of putting out a call for foreign fighters. That's the other trope, is that when we talk about foreign fighters, we're only talking about jihadists and Sunni jihadists, and foreign fighters are all across the board, including for violent white supremacists. And this drumbeat, this steady drumbeat, continues with Christchurch and El Paso. And I think there's a lot of connections there. And something that, again, to go back to my point of what can local law enforcement do, well, they're the ones with the eyes and ears on the ground and know the people who might be most closely connected to this. And again, including with overseas connections, Adam Waffen Division, the Rise Above movement, and some other white supremacist groups that are operating here on U.S. soil, some of whom have been indicted by the FBI, right? And so there's a lot of talk right now in the State Department and in Treasury and Congress about designating white supremacist groups, and it's a kind of not to tip my hand, but it's a conversation I'm involved in that's ongoing, and I think there's some interesting progress toward that end to give law enforcement the tools needed to put together a case for material support or other elements of that. The other, continuing along, that's somebody that is constrained by technology, right? And so this is the kind of neo-Luddite backlash against not only globalization, but against technology more specifically. It's ubiquitous, it's taking over our lives, and as artificial intelligence permeates throughout society, there's this perception that it's going to take away jobs in large numbers. Now, whether or not it actually does matters, but it's also the perception that matters, that it's going to. At Carnegie Mellon University, I work closely with a professor named Howie Choset, who makes the argument that no, AI is actually not going to take jobs away. But again, it's the perception that matters. And do people become violent as they anticipate losing their livelihoods and employment to robots and elsewhere? And how does that manifest itself? Where do they direct that anger and violence? Is it at corporations? So that's something to keep an eye on. And the last is also not new. It's terrorism that crops up around climate activism, and that's environmentally focused. And I don't mean to suggest in any way that people that care about the environment are terrorists, right? Someone said, wait a minute, what are you saying here? No, I mean that people will feel compelled or could feel compelled to become violent, to destroy property, and to attack persons to raise this issue. They don't think it's getting enough attention. If you look what's happening in Europe right now, in Germany, there's massive walkouts in high schools because they think the German government is not doing enough to protect against climate change. And I often think to myself, wow, if you don't think the Germans are doing enough, I wonder what people would think here with this very real issue, right? And so do people feel compelled to engage in acts of violence beyond just property destruction to elevate this concern? And so that's something I think about as well. And then there's the unknowns. What are we missing? What are we not thinking about? And again, here's where I turn to students and say that we really need you and your creativity and your bright minds to think through and help us figure out what's coming down the pike, right? How do we see beyond what's just immediately in front of our face? Because it's not always going to be just Al-Qaeda or just the Islamic State or just violent white supremacists. And I also want to push back against anytime I have given a talk on the violent white supremacy paper, people say, well, Al-Qaeda is still a threat. And I say, yeah, I know. It doesn't have to be either or. Right? We can walk and chew gum. There's a multitude of threats out there, and it doesn't have to be one or the other. When it comes down to resources, I understand it's a finite pie, right? And we have to allocate those properly, but that also harkens back to research. Going back to Bruce's keynote speech, I fall squarely into the camp of I'm somebody that's a researcher that's worked very closely with government, with the intelligence community, and I think that those partnerships are critical. I spent 3 months in Kabul, Afghanistan, working for General H.R. McMaster, who's also a Philly guy. So I was exposed to working with the Army. I was on a combined joint interagency task force that was looking at the nexus of drug traffickers and Taliban insurgents and Afghan government officials and economic power brokers. And in Afghanistan, that could all be one person, interestingly. But you know, being exposed to that kind of on-the-ground research and having some academics say, you're tainted. How could you actually go and help the military? Whereas, you know, my kind of thought process was, why wouldn't I? What is this all for? What are we doing here? If I could lend my expertise to look at transnational criminal activity and, you know, narco-terrorism, why wouldn't I do that? But thinking through and being creative again about what's coming down the pike in the near future. And that dovetails with a lot of what we've been talking about today with counterterrorism and terrorism prevention, whether you want to call that countering violent extremism, or what have you. And I think, you know, we're blessed in the United States in some ways. We're lucky. We're blessed by geography, right? And so as the caliphate continues to collapse, we're spared by 2 oceans. Now, that doesn't mean that we're completely immune. Europe's certainly in for a much rougher ride than we are, but we've got to grapple with the prospects of homegrown violent extremism. So individuals that don't have to infiltrate the United States to conduct an attack because they already live here. If you just take a look in the newspaper, there was an individual, a college student from DePaul University in Chicago that was charged last week with writing code that would help the Islamic State. And I think, you know, the incidents are kind of tailing off a little bit, but they're not going to go away. And I see that being a you know, consistent theme over the next 5 to 10 years is dealing with these kind of one-offs. And the term lone wolf to me is a bit of a contentious term, but you know, individuals that are inspired by the Islamic State and motivated by Salafi jihadism, doing things here. And that really kind of connects to the importance of education and training, which has been the main theme we've talked about all morning. In one of the morning talks, we had DSAC Walker talking about outreach, partnerships, and education. And I just really can't stress that enough because I think, again, what's the point, right? Why are we all here doing this? And so the fact that the Center for Homeland Security at DeSales University is up and running, I'm just really overjoyed and honored to be a part of everything that you guys have going on here. And I said to Ahmed, I look at this as the beginning of a relationship. And so I hope to come back out and join you and to have him out to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. But let's continue this conversation and let's keep working together. And you guys are doing some great things here. So happy to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin. So I would like to invite Brother Dan, our provost, for his concluding remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I stand between you and lunch. I'm very excited today, and I must say I'm a proud provost. And I'm a proud provost because I'm very grateful for Dr. Yala, Professor Moore, and the champion of this event, our Associate Provost, Bob Blumenstein, who helped coordinate many arms of campus to make this event happen between our marketing team, our conference services, you know, our media team, our food service, as well as, you know, providing this collaboration to happen. So I think it's very exciting that the Center for Homeland Security is happening here at DeSales University, a liberal arts university under the patronage of St. Francis de Sales, someone who modeled best for us what collaboration is all about. So I'm very grateful for all of you being here, our guest speakers most especially. And before we go to lunch, I would like to offer a blessing. God of love, God of wisdom, God of peace, send your blessings upon the Center for Homeland Security at DeSales University and on those with whom we collaborate. Open our minds and hearts to the needs of others and guide the efforts of those who protect our homeland. Bless our food, and during this time of Thanksgiving in our nation, may we be reminded of those who go without. We ask all of this in Jesus' name, amen. Enjoy lunch. Thank you for being here. Have a great day.